What up, Tolkien Poppers? This is Nick with another episode of the podcast here. And we're going to do things a little differently today. It's Christmas time and things get a little busy, and guests and other scholars and fans are hard to get a hold of during this busy season because all of us are busy. But in spite of that, I will be reading one of my first really fun pieces of scholarship that I ever published, where I really started to feel like I found my voice, and it is about South Park and Tolkien. It's published through the Tolkien Society's magazine called Malorn, so it's free online through them, and it's on my academia page. But if you really want to get, direct access to upcoming scholarship and just meet a cool group of Tolkien fans, the Tolkien Society memberships are not that bad. They're pretty good. They've got digital memberships, physical memberships, and access to a Discord community. And it's just a great place to be and meet people. And if you're trying to do Tolkien fan stuff or Tolkien scholarship, good place to be. So, do that. And, even though it's just me solo this round, just be ready for January, because I've got some kind of big name guests coming to the podcast that I'm very excited about, and I think you will too. Also, we're coming up towards the holidays here, and, I've got Tolkien Pop t-shirts and my book, Tolkien and Pop Culture Volume 1. So if you need a last-minute gift, or you just want to start the new year with a little Tolkien swag, a little integration into Tolkien scholarship or Tolkien fandom, those might be good things for you. But, I'll have those linked. And there's some citations in this essay that I will have linked as well. But I hope that you enjoy this audio version of my essay that is called Middle-earth and South Park, The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers as Parody. So, I'll stop talking at a Treebeard pace and we'll get into it. Peace. All right. Everybody, this is my Tolkien and South Park article here. Middle-earth and South Park, The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers as parody. Among the mass catalog of adaptations of Tolkien's work, there is a spectrum of integrity that is applied to them with the aims to preserve elements of Tolkien's canon. This approach of integrity is true regardless of one's feelings towards a particular adaptation, the adaptation's compromising of its available source material, or the creative liberties that the adaptation takes. In large part, most artists express a commitment to maintain the core of the original when approaching their source material, as Tom Shippey displays in his exploration of narrative canons of art. There is a tradition of parodies and satire that serve as an exception to this rule. Among this tradition belong Matt Stone and Trey Parker, the creators of the adult animated series South Park. While artists like Ralph Bakshi have approached The Lord of the Rings with a sense of fidelity, Stone and Parker have brought criticism and laughter. Stone and Parker have directly borrowed from Tolkien as well as from other media adaptations, for example, the Peter Jackson film, while making their show. This borrowing is specifically demonstrated in Season 6, Episode 13, entitled The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. Their utilization of these texts in the making of this episode have been primarily in service of comedic parody. So my primary aim is to argue that The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers fits Linda Hutchins' definition of parody as an art form of transgression, as well as operating in a way that reinforces the authority of its source material. I've decided to use the term source to refer to Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings and the Peter Jackson films rather than the term adapted text, because in the case of South Park's parodying of its sources, the sources take priority chronologically as opposed to all the texts emerging simultaneously. South Park's parody will be demonstrated through an exploration of the show's reliance on and lampooning of both Tolkien and Jackson's The Lord of the Rings. Evidence to how South Park's parody fits within the umbrella of postmodernism will be given. I'll also argue that South Park's parody, not merely as an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, imparts dignity to Tolkien's magnum opus by treating it in its cultural context. Finally, a case will be made that the return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers creates new perspectives pertaining to Tolkien's work as source material, as well as itself, South Park, and the identities of those who view the episode. This participation reinforces the Lord of the Rings influence, which in turn learns audiences back to Tolkien. The South Park episode, The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, opens with 3 of the 4 main characters of South Park, the 4th grade boys known as Cartman, Kyle, and Stan, dressed in fantasy cosplay and attempting to muster up an adventure in Stan's living room. After their first round of play, Stan's dad, Randy, enters the living room and asks the boys if they can take a rented copy of Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings to their friend Butters. The 3 boys take the videotape gladly and treat the task as a noble quest, contrary to the seemingly courteous gesture from Randy. We discover, as the adolescent party leaves the house, that his giving them the tape was a ploy to get rid of them so that he and his partner Sharon can watch a rented version of the quote-unquote hottest porno ever made, without distraction. But Randy and Sharon go upstairs to their bedroom and pop in the videotape. And before things can escalate any further, they realize that what they have put in the VCR is a copy of The Lord of the Rings, and they come to realize that the boys are in possession of the porno. Randy and Sharon race to the car to retrieve their misplaced tape. In the following scene, the boys are seen walking back to Stan's house when the headlights of Randy and Sharon's car approach them. The boys inform Stan's parents that they have already delivered the tape to Butters. Randy then asks the boys to go back and retrieve the tape, framing the errand as an extension of their quest. The boys take the tape back from Butters, who becomes a Gollum-like character and chases after them, desperate for his quote-unquote precious. Add to this a score reminiscent of Howard Shore's quote concerning hobbits, a council of 4th graders cosplaying as elves and dwarves, ring-wraith-like 6th graders who give chase to the 4th grade fellowship, and over-the-top sex education. Stone and Parker are ultimately comedians that have explicitly mentioned their approach to adaptation through parody and satire. Different episodes carry heavier emphasis on either parody or satire, but a convergence of both styles is brought to the subject matter present in each episode. South Park's handling of The Lord of the Rings contains a higher degree of parody than satire, in my opinion. There's no hint of negative judgment related to Tolkien or any of his work in the episode, nor does there abide any towards the Peter Jackson films. The overall aim of the episode is not to tear down The Lord of the Rings, but to recognize its wide cultural influence and to caricaturize it in a way that mitigates South Park's comedic intent. Linda Hutchin qualifies that in the background of parody will stand another text against which the new creation is implicitly to be both measured and understood. This is assuredly the way in which The Lord of the Rings functions for Stone and Parker in this episode. In fact, it has been argued that South Park's success is directly related to its intertextuality. Irony serves as the primary mode of Stone and Parker's jokes pertaining to their source material, as opposed to ridicule or satire. Another indication of parody's centrality of the episode. The modern form of parody does not always permit one of the texts to fare any better or worse than the other. It is the fact that they differ that this parody emphasizes and indeed dramatizes. Irony appears to be the main rhetorical mechanism for activating the reader's awareness of this dramatization. In other words, The Lord of the Rings has been stripped of its weighty teeth and been given a chattering set instead. The very background from which the narrative launches is framed in irony. When Randy sends the boys on a quote-unquote noble quest to deliver the Lord of the Rings videotape to Butters' house so that he can watch pornography with his partner, he discovers that he has given the very porno he wanted to watch to the boys. Randy then ends up with the means by which he uses to get rid of the boys, which in turn forces him to pursue them in order to obtain the porno and avoid any consequences from his mishap. Yeah, spoiler alert, he failed. It's easy to dismiss the episode as merely a silly and crude distortion of its source material. However, if we compare the story in South Park with The Lord of the Rings, we find that they hold much in common. Protagonists in both stories unexpectedly obtain an object which thrusts them into an adventure not of their own making. Similarly, both narratives position their heroes, to the extent that Cartman, Kyle, and Stan can be considered heroes, towards discarding these precious objects rather than acquiring them. There are also many one-to-one ironic allegories from the South Park episode to Tolkien's themes and characters. The porno serves as a stand-in for the One Ring, Butters as Gollum, and a boy named Clyde, whose fantasy alter ego is the High Elf of Faragon, as Elrond. Many facets of the show also contain multiple characteristics of The Lord of the Rings. Both Cartman and a boy named Jimmy share aspects and lines from Peter Jackson's film version of Gandalf. The sixth graders act like the Black Riders as well as orcs in their pursuit of the tape. This compact approach to adapting Tolkien works practically for Stone and Parker and adds levels of parodic complexity. The balancing act of navigating multiple sources, carefully appropriating the selected spoils from said sources to frame jokes and narrative, and writing South Park's world and characters to be consistent and recognizable in their own context give proof to the episode's parodic nature. But any discursive situation includes an enunciating addresser and encoder, as well as a receiver of the text. In other words, Stone and Parker as encoders had to handle Tolkien as well as Jackson's The Lord of the Rings in a way their audience would be able to recognize, so their reference-based jokes could be received properly. Again, delivering these references through the unique world of South Park and its characters in a way the audience will find familiar is crucial. Without these moving parts working in tandem, not only do the jokes risk falling flat, but the parody fails as parody or becomes something else entirely. Hutchin argues that humor is not an essential characteristic of parody, but frequently accompanies it. I follow that reasoning. South Park's maintaining of its source material for the purpose of assimilating it as the background for its own aesthetic reveals the paradoxical elements of the parody being employed. Hutchin describes the structure of proper parody being repetition with critical distance. This repetition is not only present in the characters, dialogue, and allegories found in the episode, but in the one-to-one copying of scenes in the Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers from the Peter Jackson film. In fact, this cinematographic mimicking of scenes as well as parodying characters from The Lord of the Rings continues in future episodes of the show. In the fourth episode of Season 9 entitled Best Friends Forever, one of the boys named Kenny dies and is enlisted to command the troops of heaven by God to fight the armies of hell via a PlayStation Portable, or PSP, game system. In one segment, the episode cuts to a horde of demons being armed in hell, which copies scene for scene the arming of the Uruk-hai and Isengard from Peter Jackson's The Fellowship of the Ring. Satan, the main antagonist of the episode who musters the army of demons for the assault on heaven, has an advisor/boyfriend at his side that is clearly modeled after Wormtongue. Stone exclaims in an interview with Charlie Rose, "You only get to some new truths by argument and dissent." In another interview on Nightline, he states, "Kids are selfish. They're little bastards, and society makes them better. It's not society that corrupts them." And then Parker adds after that, "See, that's probably the most conservative viewpoint we have." Stone and Parker's views on society are an indicator that they are not interested in scrutinizing things for the mere sake of destroying them, and gives further proof of their approach to parody. Commenting on South Park, Martha Doss rightly articulates and attributes the parody that the showrunners employ. She says, quote, "Rather than being an exclusionary genre, parody is an art form of inclusion. It is both combinatory and heterogeneous. Its goals are to provoke laughter and, often, to be didactic. In fact, parody can be used as a tool to reinforce the norm simply because it implies a norm exists." Unquote. So, arriving at new truths and assimilating them into the fabric of society are the primary narrative functions of South Park. However, this is done through a continuous process of argument and dissent. Nothing is sacred through the lens of South Park, and attempts to maintain such sacredness is to posture oneself antithetically to the natural function of the world. It is this understanding of the world that shapes the parody through which Stone and Parker have co-opted The Lord of the Rings. So, is South Park's parody of The Lord of the Rings conservative or progressive in approach? Hutchin's answer is yes. She says, quote, "We must never forget the hybrid nature of parody's connection with the world, the mixture of conservative and revolutionary impulses," unquote. However, for a parodic art form to embody these values well, It must be situated in a social and historical context, as well as be aware of its place in that context. This is particularly the case regarding the parody's place among its authors and audience's memories of its source material. Fans of South Park can enjoy the Return of the Fellowship of the Rings to the Two Towers on its own, but to fully understand the jokes that Stone and Parker are delivering, one must also be somewhat acquainted with the Lord of the Rings, or, at most, an active participant in Tolkien fandom or other fantasy and sci-fi communities, because humor awaits and demands from its consumers a certain degree of cognitive involvement. In the creator commentary to the episode, Stone says, quote, "If we could make every South Park episode this good, we'd be really psyched, because this is the quintessential, South Park episode," unquote. Part of why Stone and Parker hold this episode in such high esteem is the fact that they participate in and have their fingers on the pulse of a multiplicity of subcultures. Parker claims to be in a demographic of creators that are fans of the content they make, particularly their fanaticism for fantasy, sci-fi, video games, and tabletop games. Another reinforcement of South Park's Hutchonian parodic form is South Park's kinship to the genre of fantasy itself. Hans Kraw, a fantasy scholar, has argued for South Park as an appropriate conversation partner to fantasy. He says, quote, "Nevertheless, there is also a closeness between South Park and fantasy, precisely because such media fantasies are part of reality, and the current social relevance of a format such as fantasy is articulated in them," unquote. South Park may not fit the criteria of fantasy by Tolkien or fantasy scholars like Kraw, but Parker and Stone's play of fantasy elements positions the Return of the Fellowship of the Rings to the Two Towers further within the fantasy genre it parodies. To understand how Stone and Parker's parody fit Hutchins' definition, an overview of parody as a postmodern art form is necessary here. Stone and Parker's treatment of the Lord of the Rings is indeed of a postmodern persuasion. The episode embodies its source material while simultaneously pushing the boundaries of the source material. Postmodern's initial concern is to denaturalize some of the dominant features of our way of life, to point out that those entities we unthinkingly experience as natural are in fact cultural, made by us, not given to us. South Park's denaturalization of the Lord of the Rings as a cultural text and phenomenon gives its showrunners permission to distance the show from the Lord of the Rings through ironic humor. As a result, the Lord of the Rings and the catalog of its many adaptations are creatively renovated through Stone and Parker's particular parodying. Questions pertaining to Tolkien's views on adaptation and the authorization of other people's depictions of his work are commonplace in Tolkien adaptation scholarship. So before addressing Tolkien's views regarding adaptations, a distinction needs to be made between the functions of an adaptation with faithful intent and a parody with the goal to purposely transgress its source material. Tolkien's disgust with others' employment of their artistic freedom that strayed too far from what Tolkien considered faithful is not really news if you know who Tolkien is. And there are plenty of critics who champion preserving Tolkien's notion of the noble and the heroic when adapting The Lord of the Rings. So for me, playing the imagined role of Tolkien's partner and posthumously advocating for the enforcement of a universal standard of authorization pertaining to his work is not my goal. Because South Park's parody is cinematic, engaging theories of film adaptation will be helpful here in qualifying the differing aims of parody and a standard adaptation. In her article, The Accidental Tourist on Page and on Screen, Interrogating Normative Theories about Film Adaptation, Karen Klein lays out 4 critical paradigms of film adaptation. 1. Translating paradigm, a critical paradigm that judges the success of a film as an adaptation by its fidelity to its literary source material. 2. The pluralist paradigm, a critical paradigm that values a film adaptation based on how well it preserves the spirit of its source material while making changes. 3rd, transformation paradigm, a critical paradigm that views a film adaptation source material as raw material for it to use for the development of its own artistic identity. And 4th and last, the materialist paradigm, a critical paradigm that examines a film adaptation primarily as a product of cultural historical processes. All the critical theories laid out contain a unique approach in and of themselves, but these paradigms differ in degrees rather than kind, and more than one can be applied to various film adaptations. Debates surrounding the Peter Jackson films warrant all four paradigms. The translation and pluralist paradigms are fitting, as well as prevalent in the abundance of critiques employed by Tolkien fans. However, the return of the Fellowship of the Rings to the Two Towers was made without any intention of fidelity. This does not mean that either the translation and or pluralist critiques cannot be applied to the South Park episode, but to utilize those approaches would miss the point of what the episode's aims to be and do. Both the transformation and materialist paradigms are the most suitable in analyzing the South Park episode because of its parodic intent. However, the materialist paradigm is the primary way in which I wish to approach the episode because of the freedom the view provides in exploring multiple cultural factors that influence the episode's production. Additionally, the materialist approach does not fall into prioritizing the adaptation over its source material as the transformation paradigm does. Room for navigating the negotiations that Stone and Parker made between their source material and South Park, as well as valuing The Lord of the Rings as its own text, begets generous insights into a multiplicity of relationships related to the episode itself. Stone and Parker write in a way that takes nothing too seriously. To do so would cause whatever subject they address to stagnate in abstraction. Their approach to Tolkien's work does not differ in this way. If it is impervious to investigation, then it is unable to evolve. Rather than desecrate, South Park elevates its source material and dignity as living texts that are produced and received by embodied individuals, subject to scrutiny, lampoon, and growing pains. This dignifying postmodernism is achieved through a pluralistic method and mindset that goes beyond the idea of a single truth without falling into complete relativism. South Park avoids the pitfalls of attempting to establish immutable criteria to determine a standard of certainty, as well as speculating to the point of meaninglessness, relativism, in their creative execution of The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. Stone and Parker's view of arriving at new truths through argument and dissent to assimilate those truths for the benefit of society is akin to the pluralistic method mentioned above. This handling of their source material to create the episode demonstrates the interweaving of complex nuances that sets an equal playing field for a diversity of perspectives regarding their treatment of their sources, as well as perspectives related to the episode itself. Like Klein's materialist paradigm, all variables that make up a referent, for example, historical context, comprised materials, authorial intent, etc., are valuable as co-equals in their account of the knowledge of a referent that is developed from their consideration. In other words, rather than attempting to capture all that makes something true, for example, the nature of South Park's treatment of Tolkien, which will indeed result in the exclusivity of other elements that arise during or after the capturing, all aspects are placed in continual dialogue with one another. However, postmodern parody does not refute the existence of its referent, that's to say, source material, but it acknowledges that its referent exists as a representation. Humans do not have the ability to capture the entire essence of the thing being referred to. Because of this reality, all referents are representations and processed through dialogue. Postmodern art forms are expressive of the function of reality. The Lord of the Rings surely exists, and Tolkien surely existed. The modus operandi of postmodernism is not to deny these facts, as many paranoid opponents of Roland Barthes' The Death of an Author carelessly attribute to almost any postmodern work or theorist. Rather, postmodernism, in this case parody, rejects the capability to attain direct access to its source material. Any attempt to establish The Lord of the Rings as an ontological island, even from Tolkien himself, is to perceive it devoid of reality, therefore denying its being in the world. Postmodernism is a commitment to the reality that one's own tradition is not the repository of all truth. The aim of knowledge is moved from monopoly to pluralism through dialogue. Postmodernism begins by insisting that all things are interconnected, and that this pattern of relationships is constitutive of the relata, Arresting certainty and relativism are products of abstraction and therefore a historicization. Taking the living relationalities of the world to kill and observe through self-induced autopsy. Dialogue presumes living entities to converse with in reciprocal discourse. South Park's postmodernism postures itself within its historical and cultural context and ongoing transformational dialogue with the countless variables involved in the making of The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. In her essay Revision, The Lord of the Rings in Print and on Screen, Diana Paxson compares the multiplicity of visions of both Tolkien's creative process in writing The Lord of the Rings and the writing of the Peter Jackson film. She says, quote, "Until the galleys are turned in, a novel is mutable, and sometimes if there are multiple editions even after. Each art form imposes its own constraint on focus and content." Unquote. The creative process is itself a mode of postmodernism. Certain aspects of art being created are discovered and established, and others are removed to make room for other additions. It is a literal moment-by-moment revisioning of the subject. Tolkien partook in revisioning his legendarium even after the release of The Lord of the Rings. Paxson not only points out the similar ongoing revisioning of the Peter Jackson films, but she also displays that the dialogue between Jackson and Tolkien complement the other in a way that brings forth fresh perspectives on both the books and the films. And here's Paxson again. "The film shows in rich detail things which were all too briefly described in the books, whereas the books provide all the additional dialogue and explanation that the films skip over. But is it valid to have more than one version or vision of a tale? I would say yes, if the most important thing about the book is in fact not the style, but the story." In a similar way to Paxson, I see South Park's adaptation and Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings as complementary. Understanding a parody of The Lord of the Rings, like The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers, as a postmodern art form through a postmodern hermeneutic allows for a vast array of perspectives on Tolkien, his works, and adaptations thereof. Hopefully in a way that one needn't be alarmed at adaptations which seem to run far afield from whatever the sources seem to contain or perform. The fact there are an abundance of adaptations of Tolkien's works, Robin Reed argues, indicates an implicit grandeur that they hold. South Park's heavy reliance on The Lord of the Rings for narrative structure, dialogue, and characters for their punchlines demonstrate this inherent value, despite the episode's raunchy tone. Rather than attempting to preserve the core of the original at all costs, South Park creates space to laugh at The Lord of the Rings, which results in giving their audiences fresh perspectives on each medium, and arguably a deeper appreciation for both. Not all viewers of this episode of South Park will find it a beneficial addition to the growing adaptations of Tolkien's work, however. Some undoubtedly will find South Park's humor unfunny. Others will see Stone and Parker's utilization of The Lord of the Rings as a hindrance to Tolkien's placement into the Western canon of quote-unquote high culture. The opinion of each individual determines how one will react to The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers. However, a positive value judgment can be made on South Park's incorporation of Tolkien despite negative reception among Tolkien fandoms. The divide between popular culture and high culture is a line that is in constant flux. Cultural artifacts fall in and out of certain designations by different audiences throughout time. Both South Park and The Lord of the Rings have been in the middle of this cultural dialectic since their distribution. There are countless articles, book chapters, blog posts, and monographs on South Park that quote critics calling the show vile trash. The Lord of the Rings shares in this treatment, with many commentators citing the infamous dismissal of it as juvenile trash. These quotes are typically positioned by authors for the purpose of defending why these intellectual properties belong to an elevated cultural position despite negative criticism. Regardless of one's position pertaining to either South Park's or The Lord of the Rings cultural status, The Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers thrusts the viewer into the midst of this cultural conversation. Watching the episode necessitates a response from the viewer that negotiates the relationship between the two mediums. This response is inclusive of all kinds of audiences: South Park fans, Tolkien fans, fans of both South Park and Tolkien, and those who are newcomers to either The Lord of the Rings and or South Park, and even haters. Matt Hills, in his overview of fans and fan theories, has pointed out the difficulties in attempting to isolate individual fan cultures for the purpose of analysis. Academic attempts to articulate and land on a singular definition of fan is done at the cost of ignoring fandom's cultural dynamics. Another obstacle in analyzing certain fandoms is the imagined subjectivity of members of various fan communities, along with those that Hills identifies as what is called the academic fan, which are academics who are fans, and what's called the fan scholar, fans who are scholars. The high/pop cultural binary can partly be attributed to the friction that exists between ACA-fans and fan scholars, where ACA-fans prioritize academic discipline and methodology as checkpoints of canonization, and fan scholars dismiss academics for convoluting the subjects of their fandom with jargon and overanalysis. Not only do these variables make commentary on fandoms and their subjects difficult, but they can result in the construction of moral dualisms that prioritize a particular worldview, method, or imagined subjectivity over another. The challenges that Hill has pointed out regarding the dynamics of analyzing fan cultures can serve as an analogy for the relationship between fans of Tolkien and the South Park episode under examination. What imagined subjectivities are present among those in the Tolkien fandom? Additionally, how do Tolkien fans remember The Lord of the Rings? These questions are also applicable to South Park fans, as well as those who are not fans of either that encountered The Lord of the Rings or the South Park episode for the first time. What assumptions about and memories, no matter their extent, of both The Lord of the Rings and South Park do newcomers bring to their viewing? Further inquiry into these questions regarding this specific parody, as well as other mediums' relationships with Tolkien and his works is needed, but here they'll be shelved for another time. Rather than impart a particular reception of the Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers with the quality of quote-unquote good or quote-unquote bad, I share a similar goal to Matt Hill's narrative of fandom. My goal abandons the construction of easily legible moral dualism. The simple fact of encounter is beneficial to the viewer because of the response that the encounter necessitates. Opinions and identities are constructed. Internal and external dialogue is conducted. Conversation spaces are sought out and created. Where I am avoiding the moral dualism of dividing the reception of the Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers between good and bad, I'm actively arguing for the benefit of people watching the episode. Adaptations, whether parodies or intended faithful translations, place their source material in direct conversation with the artists and their creation. By extension, those who experience these works become assimilated into the broader cultural dialogue, even if people do not jump to their keyboards to join one of many of the seemingly infinite online communities dedicated to those pieces of art. The Lord of the Rings and its adapted counterparts serve as a microcosm of worlds, like a galaxy with new planets emerging and old stars dying. Conversation flows among the interplay of chaos and order, peace and violence, and life and death of this universe. It is the life force that keeps the celestial bodies in orbit around its center, namely Tolkien and his works. Complexity reigns here. How to manage that complexity remains an ongoing discussion. But to exist is to discover, and sustaining that existence with conversation means a continuing of the Tolkien cosmology. As long as there are people interested in Tolkien, there will be plenty more to discover. South Park's postmodern parodying of The Lord of the Rings is a participation in and affirmation of this dialogical discovery of Tolkien and his work. As demonstrated, parody's transformative quality is in its simultaneous transgression and reinforcement of the source it is parodying. New perspectives on Tolkien emerge while establishing him and his works in cultural canon. This is not only a result of Stone and Parker's creative approach to the episode. Their audience's existing relationship with South Park and The Lord of the Rings also contribute to the deconstruction and reconstruction of meaning of both artworks and their current content. Here, regardless of where the sources, artists, or audiences land ideologically in this process, the compromise of beginning with, ending with, and returning to Tolkien is clear.